Good morning, everyone. My name is Clark Miller, and I'm a professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. In this lecture or video, I'm going to discuss the question of what are disciplines and professions. And the motivation for this conversation is really focused on our interest in interdisciplinarity, right? And the value of being interdisciplinary. But to think about interdisciplinary, you have to start with the question of what is a discipline and really think hard about why disciplines and professions matter when we're thinking about knowledge management and knowledge analysis. So to think about a discipline and a profession, I want to go back to a couple of videos ago when we were defining the idea of what is a way of knowing. And a way of knowing we defined at the time is the set of social practices, processes, and methods that are specific or unique to a particular group and through which they create, validate, communicate, and use knowledge. And that's important because, if you want to think about it this way, right, a way of knowing then becomes a formal or an informal system for knowledge management, right? It's a set of practices and a set of tools within a particular community for managing knowledge. And a discipline or a profession as we talk about them, right? So disciplines we usually think of as academic disciplines, electrical engineering, history, English, sociology, anthropology, chemistry, biology, physics, right? Discipline, academic disciplines, or professions like medicine, nursing, the law, right? Is a formally certified or institutionalized community of people who, among other things, share a way of knowing, right? And so this idea of a way of knowing as a set of practices or tools that are unique to a particular community as they go about knowing things, making knowledge and communicating and using that knowledge, right? Then if you think about that community of people and you think about those that we have decided for one reason or another, whether it's inside the university or in society more broadly, to formally institutionalize or to certify a particular group of people because they have a particular set of knowledge, that's what we think of as a discipline or a profession, right? In other words, it's a group of people that we have set aside, set up on a pedestal, if you will, and said this group of people is important because of what they know. That's a discipline or a profession. And they're slightly different from each other, and we'll talk about that here as we go through the rest of this video. So a quick history of professions and disciplines. They're really products of social change in the late 1800s. So we're talking about the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. It's a time of fundamental change in how we think about society, and a lot of that how we think about society that was changing in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was about how we think about knowledge and the relationship between knowledge and our decisions as individuals, and our decisions as collectives, as communities, as countries, right? So in other words, policy decisions. And those changes reflect what we call the Enlightenment. Right? So if the 17th century was the century of the scientific revolution, right, and the invention of our modern formal scientific ideas and institutions, the 19th century was the century in which, in the Enlightenment, we decided that as a society, we would leverage that knowledge, those insights from science and reason and rationality, as a primary tool for making public policy, right? So if you think about democracy as a form of government, right? It's a form of government that in the 17th century, in the 18th century, as democracies are really being forged. They're being forged on a negative definition of politics, right? You don't want an authoritarian ruler. Instead, you want to give the people the power to the people, the voice to the people, and so you hold elections, and those elections elect leaders, and it's the selection of those leaders. But that doesn't give you a positive vision of what a democratic society should do, how it should exercise that political power that is given into the hands of political leaders. It just says, well, they should act in the interests of the public at large. But how do you do that? Well, one answer is rationally, right? You should reason out, right? So you think about Teddy Roosevelt at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century in the United States, and his famous phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's a statement of rationality, right? It's a statement that you can reason your way to what the best policy is by figuring out how to deliver the most good to the most number of people. You got to figure it out. You got to use knowledge, right? You got to use the expertise, right? So the 19th century is then a century in which we're transforming our politics around the idea that we should use knowledge and reason and science to guide policy decision making. That's the Enlightenment. And not surprisingly, one of the consequences of that is the evolution of the idea that we should organize groups of people who have this specialized knowledge, this expertise, these forms of reasoning, these ways of knowing that we think are important for our society. And so you see here a couple of examples of that. The American Historical Association, which was the first professional society organized around a discipline in the United States, forms in 1884, and then it begins to spread additional sub-societies that then become their own societies very quickly thereafter. The American Economics Association, the American Sociological Association, the American Political Science Association, the American Anthropological Association, right? So all of the social science disciplines begin to proliferate in the late 19th century and or right after the turn of the 20th century. Similarly, in the professions, the American Medical Association was established a little bit earlier in 1847, but it begins publication of its journal in 1883, right? So the same kind of time period, right? And so what is the Journal of the American Medical Association? It's a formal place where you can publish the best knowledge that should guide medical decision making, right? And that should guide public health decision making. JAMA, we call it, and still today, along with the New England Journal of Medicine, is like the forefront journal for publishing the most important medical science results that we need in order to make good decisions as individual doctors and collectively as a society about our health, right? So several important changes are going on in this time period. Data collection, right? The government is beginning to systematically collect quantitative information, statistics about its population and its economy. Note the linguistic link between the state and statistics, right? Statistics are those knowledge things about the state or about the population as a whole, about the economy as a whole. We're inventing the idea of economic statistics. We're inventing the idea of a gross domestic product, a gross national product, inflation. All of those ideas are emerging in economics as statistical properties of the economy. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's happening is the government is formally certifying experts for the first time, like doctors, nurses, engineers, lawyers, social workers, and more, saying if you want to practice these things, these professions, you need to get certification from the state that you know how to do this stuff, that you have the right expertise, right? And so you get tested. So the bar exam, right? Or the professional engineering certification exam. These are tests that you take before you can get certified, or you have to have special training, like a law degree or a medical degree or a nursing degree in order to get certification. right? That says you have the knowledge that you need in order to practice in this area of work and specialization, right? Third thing that's happening, right, is policy design, right? The government is beginning to use this knowledge in the design of public policy making. Social programs like Medicare, like food stamps, programs to manage natural resources like minerals and land. This was the great revolution of Teddy Roosevelt, right? Was the development of forestry policy, land policy, water policy in the United States, all based on bringing experts to Washington and putting them to work designing policies that rationally manage our natural resources in order to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the United States. And in order to do that, you got to have agencies for them to work in. So that's number 4, right? The government is beginning to organize knowledge-based agencies. So the U.S. Forestry Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is about the professionalization of police forces. There's a whole series of federal government agencies that get created in this time period that are knowledge-based agencies. And this is when we began setting up federal statistical agencies too. We have 66, last time I counted, federal statistical agencies that collect data for the federal government, right? And so then finally, universities are also beginning to change because they're now training people, providing them with expertise specifically to go into government programs, but also other kinds of decision-making settings, right? So one of the things that happens in the early 20th century is the formation of business schools, and the Masters of Business Administration degree, the MBA degree, is invented, and it's specifically for training experts who know how to run large business organizations. So as part of this transformation of government and expertise and how we exercise knowledge, we're also changing the university. So the university is getting departments like history, economics, sociology, political science, chemistry, physics, right? It's differentiating its activities. You don't just have a faculty of sciences or a faculty of arts. You now have departments that are specialized. It's getting professional schools, business, but also the law school, the journalism school, the social work school, the School of Public Administration, which is the counterpart to the business school, but for people who want to go run governments. We're inventing the idea of a scientist, right? So in the 17th century, we invented science and scientific institutions. The people who practiced in those institutions were gentlemen in Britain, right? And what's interesting about the 19th century is that we're getting the idea that one can professionally be a scientist, right? That can be your primary job title, your primary job identity is that you do science, right? And it becomes a particular kind of person who is a scientist. And of course, along with this comes the idea that research is something that society should invest in, and it sets the groundwork for the first half of the 20th century, in which we radically ramp up the funding of scientific research across the US federal government and across governments worldwide. It's the first time in history that society has, all right, so part of what created science in the 17th century was royalty putting some of their money to fund science, right? So you have the Royal Society in Britain, for example, in granting a charter. So it's not that governments have not been involved in science before, but they have not systematically spent huge amounts of money. Today, we spend $130 billion a year in the United States on scientific research and development. It's a huge sum of money, right? That idea, we're laying the groundwork for that idea in this period, in this idea that we make better decisions if we base those decisions on science and research. So that's what a discipline or a profession is, and that's the transformation of society that they come out of, right? They are communities of people who are defined and formalized in terms of what they know, certified for their knowledge, and given privileged places in society for exercising that knowledge in decision making. Thank you.